So before we go into the PPT itself, it is important to understand what does Napoleon actually mean. So Napoleon, born on a small island called Corsica, was actually a person who used the revolution quite well and became the part of the military, and very quickly, because of his administrative skills, went up the ranks. So he's known for his law and order. And the basic point is that the basic quality of Napoleon, which made him very, very important, was that he was a good administrator. So the Napoleonic era is considered very, very important because it is in this period that France will stabilize. Because first, he will stop the war in 1802. Over and above that, he will bring in educational, religious, and economic reforms which were needed. And one of the most important concepts was called the Napoleonic codes, which you don't need to go into too much detail, but basically these codes allowed for basic law and order to be there. So Napoleon, between 1799 and 1804, technically made France stable, and thereafter went for war with the world in order to spread the message of the French Revolution, but technically to expand the French Empire. So basically, on the eve of Napoleon capturing power, the situation was still despicable because just producing constitutions in 91, 93, 95, 99 technically gives you no real power or does stabilize the country. The basic point was that the country was still the same. So, high inflation, very, very bad financial situation, government was corrupt, we already saw that. And the bourgeoisie now actually just wanted stability and growth rather than the revolution. The point was that the revolution seemed too very, very big. Basic point was now we want stability. And the man chosen for that is going to be Napoleon. Why Napoleon? Very good question. Defeated Italy and Austria, a very important man of power. More than that, spread the ideas of the revolution wherever he went and considered an epitome of law and order, a good administrator. And he was neither rightist or leftist, a person who was actually chosen by everybody and accepted by everybody. So, who is Napoleon Bonaparte? 1769, born on an island of Corsica, which was conquered by the French later, educated in French military school, and the French Revolution provided him with a lot of opportunity where he became the commander and then showed how he could actually be a good administrator and a good military general. Now, during the revolution, Napoleon actually wanted the ancient regime to go away. He wanted a better status for his homeland also. He used the opportunity for his own promotion, became very, very important. Napoleon became a Jacobean initially and wanted to make sure that during the Thermidorian reaction, there is no loyalist who is coming back or the royalist who is coming back, but took parts in the campaigns of the terror also. So he was a person who believed that the French society needed to be cleansed, and that is a very important point. Now comes his rule, which is called the consulate rule, which is 3 council and 3 legislative assemblies. And it is during his consulate rule between 1799 to 1804 that France will finally become stable. So, what is the structure? What is the concept? He wrote this constitution himself, very closely monitored it. 3 councils, actual power with the first council, which is nothing but Napoleon. Legislative body with 3 houses. Focus on establishing order, restoring peace, and settling with the peace with the neighbors. The basic point was we want to have peace now. And the point which you need to again understand is, first thing he will do is that in 1802, he will finally stop the war. He will first defeat Austria in 1801 and then make peace with England in 1802. Peace finally returned after a decade because between 1792 and 1802, there is war, but only for 2 years technically because the war is going to start again. The basic point is the first change which he brings in, these administrative changes, is called the Napoleonic Code of Law, which is 1804. And the basic point is he had a civil code for civil, basic how you interact with people. He also had a code for civil procedure, how the courts would go about it. Then a penal code for the courts, code of criminal procedure, and a commercial code to support the basic mercantile group. Embraced the old and the radical, both. Open court hearings, justice to be delivered in front of everybody. principal equality before law. However, women did not gain too much out of what Napoleon did. According to him, the second thing which was important was administrative reform. So he focused on strong and well organized government. He will start to structure the whole society and government in a very, very good way. Retain principles of equality and eliminator of privileges. Napoleonic Code gave a lot of streamlined support to legal procedure. The next thing which he moved was educational reform. Educational reform is important because France needed to be a better nation according to Napoleon in a way that it could understand law better and as an example for the world itself. So he replaced the church control over the schools by public control. Basically, now the church will not control what will be taught in the public schools, but the government will control that. Education was classified into primary, secondary, technical, and university. Again, very, very important. Vocational schools were started to give people employment. And Paris University was restructured. He was the one who actually appointed a lot of teachers in the university itself. And that is the whole point. Scholarships were given to very, very important, brilliant students who will then take France forward. And he promoted literature, art, and sciences. As a person, he was a very, very, very ardent supporter of education generally. Then further comes the most important act which he did was finally economic reform in France. First thing, Bank of France finally in 1800. This was one of the weaknesses under Louis XVI. Public loans were granted to citizenry, mainly if you want to reconstruct. So you reconstruct via the loans given to the citizens. Then land redistribution in order to give the peasants some relief. Development of means of transport, promoted automation, all technically to make France stronger so that it can go to war. Exhibitions to promote French commodities and have or push commodities made by the French on their colonial states and the colonial governments and technically the colony itself. Basically, he wanted to make sure that the colonial mode of trade and subjugation of territories and the countries which were technically, specifically Indochina, he was trying to push into Indochina and trying to push French commodities into this whole region which we call as Indochina and Asia specifically. Now, once the economic reforms were done, the basic point and the key concepts behind his reforms were very simple. Legal equality for everyone, very, very important because at the end of the day, law for him was almighty. No recognition of nobility and titles of birth, so technically dismantling the second estate itself properly now. Freedom of religion, so that you can pursue what you want to. Separation of church and state, a very important part of separation of power. Further, freedom to work in any occupation and protection of the family. Basically, for him, family was the basic social unit. Further, the flaws with the Napoleonic codes and the reforms was he still considered women as inferior to men. So the gender dimension is a problem. Women could not vote. Husbands had complete control over wives and their personal property, and children and unmarried women had few rights. So basically, the things which were inherited from the Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizen. Basically, that is the whole point. He did not do anything very, very radical. Now, the fifth reform which he did was religious. And this is again very, very important because it was important to make sure that Napoleon had a good relationship with the church because church control is very, very important. So an agreement was made with Pope Pius VII that Catholicism will become a state religion of France. This was the concession he gave under the agreement which is called the Concordat. On the other hand, now he will take away power from the church. So Pope could not appoint a bishop without the recommendation of Napoleon. Church abandoned claims to property which were nationalized by Robespierre and previously. The Gregorian calendar was finally reintroduced and the 1793 calendar was actually abandoned. And the church was brought under the state's supervision entirely. So one concession he gave, but he took religion into his own hands. So Napoleon knew that he had to control the church in order to control France itself. So basically, the basic task of Napoleon between 1799 and 1802 was to bring back the stability into France because his larger plan was to go for war. So Senate will elect Napoleon consul for life, technically a dictator in a way. And in 1804, he will then technically declare himself as the hereditary emperor of France. And now France had taken full circle, starting with Louis XVI, going to the constitutional monarchy, then republic, then what we call as directory, consulate rule, then we have 1802 and then 1804. They were finally back with a dictator. And this is the whole irony of the French Revolution. They still again come back to the Napoleon as a monarch or as an emperor. And this is the irony of the French Revolution, that the son of the French Revolution itself, Napoleon, then did what technically the French Revolution did not argue for, which is undemocratic monarchical emperorship. So now, once he becomes emperor, he will technically fully become a dictator, strangle the press freedom, squash any dissent. Political opponents were fully imprisoned, planned to now spread the ideals of the revolution via conquest. Technically, he wanted to build the French Empire. And after 1802, within 2 years, now France is going to fight what we call as the Napoleonic Wars. The Napoleonic Wars themselves are quite interesting because in 1803, England declared war on France, beginning the War of the Third Coalition, meaning first and two coalitions fought with the Jacobians and the Girondinist government, the Basic National Convention, the Directory, now the Third Coalition. Then colonial imperialistic war, it was about technically making sure that the colonies of England were somehow blockaded, or France wanted to take basic colonies of Britain at this point of time. England wanted safety for its Indian Empire and its business all around the world. France wanted to subjugate entire Europe and disrupt English trade. And the basic point is he will have a lot of success against Austria and Prussia. He will actually be the one who will dissolve the Holy Roman Empire by 1806. But England was too powerful for France. So at the Battle of Trafalgar, French and the Spanish fleets were destroyed by the British. So one thing was very, very clear, that he could not defeat the British on water. So Napoleon will now recede from naval battles and focus on the field. And he will go for what is called the continental blockade system, which is to block England from the whole continent, starve it out. But England had India, and the same system will be applied by England, which will be much, much more powerful. On the other hand, what he had success is the Battle of Austerlitz, which is Napoleon defeated Austria-Prussia. Confederation of Rhine will be formed by the Peace of Pressburg. The Holy Roman Empire will be dissolved in August of 1806 when Austrian Emperor will abdicate his throne. So basically, he will be the one who will trigger what we call as the German unification, because that is the starting point of the German unification, and we'll talk about that in the next video itself. What is more important is he will go for now the British, which is the continental system, which is Britain, too powerful as a naval power, but still Napoleon did not back off. Napoleon decided to go after trade and commerce with the continental system. European countries must carry out Napoleon's ordinances and orders. Economic boycott of England and embargo on British ships, barricading the British Isles and colonies. And the basic point was, what was the solution was that the English would do the same with the French, and that was much more effective. The English issued orders to prevent French ships from crossing their dominion or the areas which were technically dominated by the British, suspended trade with Napoleon, and in turn this led to what we call as the continental blockade on both hands, but the French were not too powerful. So basically the French argued that nobody is going to trade with technically England, and England did the same with France. So basically both had an embargo system, but the English were much, much more powerful than the French, and as a naval power, they were much, much more effective. So basically, controlling the seas was not in the hands of France, and Napoleon will technically start to struggle on this. The impact would be that once he will get more or less frustrated on land and in sea in the western sector, he will turn towards and do his biggest mistake, which is to go to Russia. And once the Russian campaign, which is the Moscow campaign, will be a failure, Napoleon had to become too weak. So the impact is connections of countries to the colonies were now snapped, extremely detrimental to European trade itself. European businessmen saw slump in business itself. Smuggling increased throughout Europe. scarcity of essential commodities, and beginning of the fall of Napoleon, because he will now turn towards the Moscow and the Russian campaign. Napoleon could not make use of this scarcity of fruit grains. England was still surviving because of India, and the French industries could not develop because of the fact that the British goods were too much important to the whole empire and to Europe itself. So they could not be developed as an alternative to British goods itself. Too good quality, too expensive for the French to produce it. So basically, France itself did not do anything or develop, and more than that, Napoleon could not use this as a form of political power. Now, the decline was the desperation of Napoleon. Britain had a massive navy, technically, France not even comparable. Britain used its navy to impose strong blockade of France, the same treatment France got. Napoleon's despotic orders actually turned allies into enemies, specifically the Spanish. Spain was initially an ally of France, but later turned against it, absorbed Napoleon into new wars, specifically the Spanish wars, which are called the Peninsular Wars also. And then will come the desperation. The desperation to go to Russia because he wanted more area. Moscow campaign 1812 it will start. Napoleon lost most of his army because of the severe winters. He went to Russia in the winters, the Siberian winters, did not have the clothes, did not have the foods. Most of them will die of hunger and severe winters. This will destabilize Napoleon, and Napoleon will now become weak. Technically, by the Treaty of Fontainebleau by 14th April 1814, he had given up. He had given up on Moscow. He had given up on what he was trying to do. And Napoleon's abdication was now technically in motion. And by 1814, it was clear that Napoleon will not win. Napoleon had technically defeated the purpose of the French Revolution. He had become a dictator himself. And at the Battle of Leipzig, where 16th October 1813, Napoleon was defeated by a joint front of Russia, Austria, Britain, and Sweden. Napoleon had to abdicate the throne, as we saw what the Treaty of Fontainebleau. He was made the ruler of Elba because the French people liked him. He was also given a pension of 20 lakh francs. However, he was not going to sit. Once the Battle of Leipzig is done and the Treaty of Fontainebleau is signed, he will technically be sent to Elba, and the Congress of Vienna will be convened. And whilst the Congress of Vienna, they were trying to figure out what to do with France, Napoleon will come back and he will then fight his last battle, which is Waterloo. So basically, Congress of Vienna 1814, after the abdication of Napoleon, the winning countries now convened at the Congress of Vienna. Bourbon monarchy was reinstated, meaning Louis XVIII was back, and this is the whole irony. France had taken full circle, started with Louis XVI, now they had Louis XVIII. France had gone from constitutional monarchy to republic to directory to consulate to Napoleon and back. And this is the whole point. This is the paradoxical history of France, which is its whole full circle it had taken. The next point is that the frontiers of the French were restored to the 1792 limits when the war started. The countries initially disagreed the problems of remapping Europe. At this point of time, Napoleon will use this disagreement to come back. So he will take the advantage of the disagreement between European powers at the Congress of Vienna. Return from Elba, volunteers started to enlist in his army. In the 7th coalition, finally, when it will fight Napoleon, Napoleon will be defeated at the Battle of Waterloo on 18 June 1815, will be exiled to St. Helena, and that was the end of it. Hereafter, Napoleon ceased to be a very important personality in history, but the downfall of Napoleon was generally based on his own attitudes and how he had technically defeated the purpose of the French Revolution. His dictatorial attitude will not take him far. Very ambitious, turns friends into enemy, which is Spain the best example. Repeated and prolonged warfare was not a good one. Mostly, the point was Moscow campaign was suicidal. Surge of nationalism in the subjugated territories, specifically Germany and Italy. Failure of the continental system because the French navy was not that strong. Further, Peninsular Wars, which is fighting with Spain, was also not good. Then Russian campaign suicidal. Weak French navy. And undue attachment to blood relatives, because wherever he went, he used to establish or appoint his own relatives, and they were not as good as Napoleon as administrators. Now, the basic point is, what is the significance? This is technically the end of this module. What is the significance of the French Revolution? The French Revolution as an event is extremely important because of the impact on France itself, which is freedom, equality, and liberty as ideas became important. Fraternity as an idea became very, very important. Secularization and decline of role of church in France. But remember, politically, it was a full failure because at the end of the day, they were back to the monarchy. Ironically, it will only be in 1870 that they will become what we call as a third republic. But we'll talk about that once we'll talk about unification of Germany and Italy. Destruction of feudalism in France and centralized system of government was there. Largely it was there, but ironically by 1815 everything was back, and that is the whole point. At its moment of transition, the basic point is between 1789 to 1814 this event had a major bearing on how people thought, and it was an important moment. But as a country it went backwards in that way. So the growth of nationalism, constitutionalism, democracy, and parliamentarianism was actually the direct consequence, and more than that, the declaration of rights of man and citizen, though with its problems, was also a very significant document which became the preamble for all constitutions which were going to come later. So the basic point was that France as a country was paradoxical. The wars with France weakened European colonial powers also. Spanish and Portuguese will now see the end of their domination. Abolition of slavery also happened at this point of time. Jacobean constitution was the first genuinely democratic constitution drafted for a republican country. But the whole point was Robespierre actually never implemented that 1793 constitution, which is the constitution it is referring to. And that is the irony of it, that Robespierre was the first son of the revolution, again a dictator, very brutal. Napoleon the same. The Napoleonic codes itself were very, very significant because they introduced a civil code. Some of its provisions, like merit-based recruitment to government jobs, focused on clearly written laws, continued to affect present-day legal system in France and across the world. Inspired movements against colonialism in countries, and at the end of the day, the American Revolution and the French Revolution act as two basic foundations of the modern world, because at the end of the day, they change the vocabulary of the world itself. So, with this, unit is over. Basically, and what you need to remember is causes is very, very important, and significance is very, very important. What does it mean and why was this very, very important? Remember, course, you will never be asked a question because it's too long to be asked. But remember basic dates such as 1791, 93, 95, 99. Here remember 2, 2, 4. This is the basic way you can remember. Constitutional monarchy, republic, directory, consulate. And basically the point is that as an event, the significance and the French Revolution ideals were very, very important. Together, American Revolution and the French Revolution are considered two pillars of modern world. So let's see what type of question has come in the previous years. So explain how the foundation of the modern world was laid by American and French Revolution. 15 marks, 250 words, 2019. Very easy question if you look at it. You will have introduction, body, conclusion. You will not write it in the exam. In the first half, you will write what are the foundations of the modern world. The foundation of the modern world is technically what? Is freedom, liberty, fundamental rights, DPSP, concept of representation, the concept of what we call as rights against exploitation. The point is that the whole modern world is based on basic pillars which were introduced during these two revolutions. So you're going to talk in the body that how the American Revolution introduced the concept of representation, the concept of what we call as liberty, freedom, right against exploitation, and how the French Revolution technically gave the world the Declaration of Right of Man and Citizen. And the basic point is rights, justice, Napoleonic codes, all were extremely important in creating what we know as the modern world. and conclude by just restating, yes, the foundation of the modern world was laid down by the American and French Revolution by introducing these words into the vocabulary of the world itself. It's a very easy question if you look at it in the larger context. So now some prospective questions for you, how we can go forward and understand the whole revolution itself. So one would be, what were the immediate causes of the French Revolution? Discuss the contribution of women to the French Revolution. Very easy question. Again, introduction, body, conclusion. In the introduction, you're going to talk about how France was in the 17th century. Then, though that talking about the immediate causes, you will talk about how the long-term causes become the basic context in which the immediate causes are going to work. Immediate causes were what? It was the American Revolutionary War and the economic crisis. And the role of women was very, very important because they were the ones who used to run the saloons and were the ones who were spreading the message of the French Revolution. And conclude by talking about the intermixing of these causes. So I would encourage you to write to us through this on iaslive@byju's.com or to send it to target@byju's.com, and we will be happy to evaluate it for you. Then another important question for you. Do you agree that the French Revolution really achieved far less than what it intended to effect? A very important question. Again, introduction, body, conclusion. In this, you are going to talk about the French Revolution, how it began. Then you will talk about the ideals, which was to be democratic. And then basically you will say that they will keep on producing different constitutions. But the basic point was that, and in the end, basically they ended up with Louis XVIII only. So basically it achieved far less than it actually intended for. Not even democracy they got. Now just one last question for your understanding and consolidating it. What is meant by the crisis in the ancient regime? How did it contribute to the outbreak of the French Revolution? Technically, this is a question on the long-term causes. So basically now you can understand how the two type of questions can be made. Immediate causes, long-term causes. Now before I end the session, you need to understand one thing, which is that the French Revolution and the American Revolution are two very important, very, very important events. French Revolution course itself has no purpose to you, but remember the causes is a very, very important point. Remember that the causes can be divided into long-term and immediate, and the significance is very, very important. Though it technically achieved nothing, it is very, very important. Remember the constitution dates because that again becomes important. The basic point is that the French Revolution as such is a very paradoxical event. But in the end, it turned out to be a very important movement, a very important idea generating revolution. And more than that, Napoleon is going to play a very important role in the next module which we are going to cover, which is the unification of Germany and Italy. So with this, I would like to end the session. Thank you so much for your patience. I hope to see you again in the next video, which is